A whole clove of garlic, sitting unbroken in a jar, contains almost none of the compound most people associate with garlic's health benefits. The compound has to be created. It does not exist in the intact clove at all, and understanding that single fact explains more about why a supplement bottle so often underperforms a kitchen counter than any marketing claim on either side of that comparison. Inside an unbroken clove of garlic sits a molecule called allicin, stable, odorless, biologically unremarkable on its own. Sitting nearby, kept separate by the plant's own cellular structure, is an enzyme called allicin. The two never meet until something breaks the cell walls between them: a knife, a crush, a bite. The moment that happens, allicin converts a line into a new compound entirely, allicin, the sulfur-containing molecule responsible for garlic's sharp smell and for the majority of its documented pharmacological activity. This detail, that the active compound in garlic has to be manufactured fresh through a chemical reaction triggered by physical damage to the clove, is where most garlic supplements run into a problem that has nothing to do with dosage claims printed on the label and everything to do with manufacturing chemistry. Allicin is unstable once formed. It degrades under heat, degrades in stomach acid, and degrades over time sitting in a pill on a shelf. A supplement manufacturer trying to deliver allicin to a customer's bloodstream is fighting the same instability a home cook fights by mincing garlic at the last possible moment before it hits a hot pan, except the manufacturer is fighting it across a production timeline measured in weeks or months, not minutes. Some manufacturers solve this reasonably well. Standardized garlic powder tablets, the kind used in a large share of the clinical research behind garlic's reputation, have shown allicin bioavailability studies put at around 80%, meaning the allicin to allicin conversion largely survives the trip from pill to bloodstream when the product is formulated correctly. Other approaches solve it far worse. Research specifically measuring allicin release from commercial garlic supplements has documented what one study bluntly titled a major problem, tied directly to how sensitive the alliinase enzyme is to the manufacturing process itself, meaning the very reaction the supplement depends on can be partially or substantially destroyed before the product ever reaches a customer. Enteric coating, a common feature marketed as protecting the supplement's contents from stomach acid until it reaches the intestine, turns out not to reliably solve this either. Comparative research has found enteric-coated garlic supplements showing no meaningful bioavailability advantage over non-coated versions, undercutting one of the more common premium claims printed on supplement packaging. None of this means every garlic supplement is worthless, and the honest version of this story includes that nuance rather than flattening it into blanket condemnation. What it means is that garlic supplements sit on a spectrum, with well-formulated standardized powder tablets on one end, delivering something close to what the clinical trials behind garlic's reputation actually tested, and poorly formulated pills on the other end, delivering a small fraction of that, with no reliable way for a customer standing in a pharmacy aisle to tell which end of that spectrum a given bottle sits on. Since allicin content is rarely disclosed on the label, in a form a consumer could compare across brands, a crushed clove of garlic at home has no such ambiguity. The allicin to allicin conversion happens in real time, in the kitchen, generating the compound at essentially full strength before it degrades. The trade-off is that this freshly generated allicin then has to survive cooking, and heat destroys it quickly, which is why the traditional advice among people who have cooked with garlic for generations, crush it and let it sit for 10 minutes before adding it to a hot pan, has real chemistry behind it, rather than functioning as an old wives' tale. That resting period gives the allicin enzyme time to complete the conversion before heat denatures it, maximizing the allicin generated before cooking begins to break it back down. The research behind garlic's cardiovascular reputation is worth being precise about, rather than overstating. A meta-analysis pooling data across 39 separate studies found a statistically significant reduction in total cholesterol, averaging around 17 milligrams per deciliter, a meaningful though modest effect, alongside a reduction in LDL cholesterol that did not reach statistical significance across the pooled data. Separate research comparing garlic tablets against a cardioprotective dose of aspirin for antiplatelet activity, the blood-thinning effect relevant to clot prevention, found garlic produced a measurable effect in that direction as well, though garlic and aspirin work through different mechanisms and are not interchangeable treatments for anyone managing an actual cardiovascular condition under medical supervision. Type 2 diabetes research on garlic supplementation shows a similarly real but modest pattern. Meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials have found garlic supplementation associated with improvements in components of metabolic syndrome, blood sugar and lipid markers among them, using doses in the clinical literature ranging quite widely, from 50 milligrams up to 1.5 grams of garlic preparation daily depending on the specific trial and formulation tested. This range itself says something important. The clinical evidence for garlic is not built around one precise, universally agreed dose, the way a pharmaceutical trial would be designed. It is built around a range of preparations and doses, each showing modest positive effects, which is a very different evidentiary picture than a manufacturer implying a specific pill replicates one specific landmark study. Garlic's reputation as medicine, rather than merely food, has a specific, well-documented modern chapter worth including. During the First World War, and again during the Second World War, when antibiotics were either not yet invented or not yet available at the scale battlefield medicine required, military doctors on multiple sides used raw garlic juice applied directly to wounds as an antiseptic, a practice sometimes referred to informally as Russian penicillin, given its documented use by Soviet military medics. This was not folk superstition operating in the absence of alternatives. Garlic's antimicrobial properties, driven by the same allicin generated through cell disruption, are genuinely measurable in laboratory settings against a range of bacteria, which is precisely why it functioned as a real, if imperfect, antiseptic before modern antibiotics existed and made the practice largely obsolete outside of survival medicine contexts. Immune function research on garlic follows a similar pattern to the cardiovascular data, real but modest, and worth stating without inflating it. A frequently cited trial testing daily garlic supplementation against a placebo over a cold and flu season found participants taking garlic reported fewer colds and, when they did get sick, shorter illness duration compared to the placebo group. This is one trial, rather than an overwhelming consensus, and immune function research generally is difficult to run cleanly, given how many variables affect a person's likelihood of catching a seasonal illness. It sits in the research literature as a genuinely promising, not yet definitively settled, finding, which is a more honest description than either dismissing it or treating it as proven fact. There is a reason grandmothers across an enormous range of culinary traditions, well before any of this chemistry was understood, converged independently on garlic as a kitchen staple, treated with something close to medicinal respect. Ancient Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, and Mediterranean food and medical traditions each developed garlic-based remedies centuries before allinase or allicin had names, working purely from observed effect rather than mechanism. This kind of convergent discovery across unconnected cultures, the same pattern that showed up with purslane and wild greens in Mediterranean longevity research, tends to be a reasonably reliable signal that something real is happening, even when the explanation for why arrives thousands of years later. Aged garlic extract represents a separate approach entirely, distinct from both raw garlic and the standardized powder tablets discussed earlier, and it deserves its own mention rather than being lumped in with generic supplements. Instead of trying to preserve or deliver allicin directly, aged garlic extract is produced by letting sliced garlic sit in a diluted alcohol solution for an extended period, often many months, a process that converts the compounds present into a different set of stable, water-soluble sulfur compounds, S-allicystine chief among them. This sidesteps the allicin instability problem entirely by not depending on allicin as the active ingredient at all. Research on aged garlic extract specifically has shown its own separate body of cardiovascular and antioxidant findings, and it represents a legitimately different strategy, rather than simply another attempt to stabilize the same unstable compound. Worth knowing about specifically because it is not competing on the same terms as either raw garlic or standard allicin-focused supplements. A retired postal worker in his early 60s began adding 2 crushed cloves to his evening meal most nights, motivated less by any single study and more by a habit his own grandmother had kept her entire life, mincing garlic and letting it rest on the cutting board before it went anywhere near a hot pan. He did not track his cholesterol obsessively or expect a dramatic before and after story. What he described after several months was mundane in the way most real dietary changes actually are, a lipid panel at his annual physical that had moved modestly in the right direction, alongside a habit that had become automatic enough he no longer thought about it as an intervention at all, simply as how he cooked dinner. This is roughly the scale of change the pooled clinical data would actually predict, not a transformation, a nudge sustained long enough to compound. For anyone deciding between raw garlic and a supplement, rather than treating the question as settled, The practical guidance drawn from the research is reasonably simple to state, even if the underlying chemistry is not. If choosing a supplement, standardized powder tablets with disclosed allicin content and evidence of the bioavailability testing referenced in the clinical literature perform closer to what trials have actually measured than an undisclosed proprietary blend. If choosing raw garlic, crushing or mincing it, and letting it rest for roughly 10 minutes before it meets any heat source maximizes the allicin actually generated before cooking begins degrading it, a small procedural detail that costs nothing and requires no special equipment, just patience most people skip, because a recipe rarely bothers to explain why the step matters. Raw garlic is not without its own caveats, and naming them plainly matters here, as much as anywhere else on this list. Garlic has real blood-thinning properties, meaningful enough that anyone on prescribed anticoagulant medication or scheduled for surgery should mention regular garlic consumption to whoever manages that care, the same way they would mention a supplement. Large quantities of raw garlic on an empty stomach can cause genuine gastrointestinal irritation in some people, heartburn and stomach upset being the most commonly reported issues, and raw garlic's smell and taste intensity, the same sulfur compounds responsible for its benefits, is simply not something everyone wants to build into a daily habit, which is a legitimate reason some people reach for a supplement instead, provided they understand what trade-off they are actually making by doing so. What ties this back to the supplement aisle is not that pills are inherently a scam. It is that the specific chemistry of allicin, unstable, generated only through physical disruption of the raw clove, degraded by heat and time and processing, makes garlic an unusually difficult compound to package reliably compared to something more chemically stable like a vitamin. A crushed clove sitting on a cutting board for 10 minutes, then added to a dish, is not folk medicine competing against modern pharmacology. In garlic's specific case, it may simply be a more reliable delivery mechanism than a manufacturing process fighting the same unstable chemistry at industrial scale, weeks before the product reaches anyone's kitchen at all.